Now this is one of the best, strongest, and fastest Eagle Evade Spiritborn build in Season 6. With this build you can easily speed farm tier 100 pits in under 2 minutes. This build focuses on damage, survivability, and speed to easily clear the hardest content in the game. Now this is an endgame build, so you'll need to have specific gear and will need to masterwork certain stats to push the Spiritborn to easily and quickly speed farm the highest tier pits. And I highly recommend you to watch this video from the beginning to the end to see how everything synergizes. So let's check this out. So first I'm going to show you clearing a tier 100 pit. I can easily speed farm tier 100 pits, gaining tons of experience and glyph levels. I can clear tier 100 pits in under 2 minutes and easily clear lower tier pits in under 1 minute. Now what's more important than greater affixes on your gear is masterworking your gear on specific stats to greatly boost your damage and speed. And this build is so strong that it can easily destroy huge groups of enemies and quickly shred bosses. This build can handle any uber bosses and easily beat uber Lilith. Now the main source of damage coming from this build comes from the Eagle Spirit Hall, which will allow you to cast storm feathers whenever you evade and make enemies vulnerable. Another source of damage for this build comes from a legendary node, the Vicious Shield legendary node, and having tons of life. And another big boost of damage is coming from stacking resolve stacks, because stacking resolve will greatly increase your block chance because of a legendary aspect, the aspect of interdiction, and combining another legendary aspect, the aspect of redirected force. Increasing your block chance will greatly increase your critical strike damage, making it easy to speed farm tier 100 pits. And because of a legendary aspect, the Fell Soothsayer's aspect, we can easily destroy groups of enemies, making it really easy to speed farm high tier pits. And with this build you want to stack armor because of a legendary aspect, the aspect of unyielding hits, because stacking armor will greatly increase your damage. Now there are certain key skills and items for this build to work. Now in order to evade infinitely with this build, you will need to have at least 4 evade charges for this build, but putting skill points in the acceleration skill in the skill tree will give you 3 additional evade charges. So any types of boots will work. You will also need at least 80% cooldown reduction or evade cooldown reduction combined in order to have infinite evades. But having certain gear and masterworking certain stats, you can easily achieve these stats to have infinite evade with this build. And this build includes many skills and gear that complement each other, offering a lot of powerful combinations. But I'll cover everything in more details in their dedicated sections. Okay, so next for the skills. Now the basic skill I'm using is Thunder Spike, and we are not actually using this skill. This skill will auto cast when we evade, and on the third evade, this skill will attack further and reset the cooldowns of our evades, allowing us to evade infinitely. But I do want to mention that sometimes this skill bugs and the third attack does not come out. So if you run out of evade charges, just use this skill to gain all your evade charges back. The next skill I'm using is the ultimate skill, the Hunter, and this skill will leap you to an area doing AoE damage to enemies. This skill will also greatly increase your ferocity, and while this skill is active, you have a chance to reset the skill's cooldown when you kill an enemy. And this skill will even allow you to leap through walls, making it very easy to speed through dungeons. The next skill I'm using is Armored Hide, and this has a passive ability that gains you resolve stacks, and resolve will greatly increase your damage reduction. And when you activate this skill, you will gain unstoppable and max resolve stacks. And while this skill is active, your block damage reduction is increased for every nearby enemy. The next skill I'm using is Scourge, and this skill will call forth a centipede, poisoning enemies and slowing and fearing enemies around. This skill will also greatly increase your damage to crowd controlled enemies for every enemy the skill crowd controls. Now this skill is really good for greatly increasing your damage, and because of a legendary aspect, the menacing aspect, Scourge will constantly affect enemies around you. The next skill I'm using is Ravager, and this skill has a passive ability that grants you ferocity, and while this skill is active, your attacks will also do more damage. And when you kill an enemy while this skill is active, the duration of this skill is increased. Now we are mainly using this skill to increase our damage. And the last skill I'm using is Counterattack, and we are just getting this skill for the passive buffs. The passive buff will gain you dodge chance, but most importantly, it will greatly increase your critical strike damage for every close enemy. Okay, so next for the Spirit Hall. Now the primary spirit I'm using is the Eagle Spirit, and this states, casting an Eagle skill grants 8 seconds of Storm Feathers movement speed bonus. When you evade, fling up to 8 Storm Feathers for every remaining second, each dealing 762,085 lightning damage and making targets vulnerable for 10 seconds. All skills are now also Eagle skills. Now the Eagle Spirit Hall is important because the Eagle Spirit is our main source of damage when we evade. The Eagle Spirit will also make enemies vulnerable, which will greatly increase our damage. And for the secondary spirit, I took Gorilla, and this states, maximum resolve increased by 2. When you have at least 5 stacks of resolve, you are unstoppable. Now increasing your resolve stack is really important for this build to greatly increase your critical strike damage. And with this secondary spirit, you will also be unstoppable because this build will mostly always have your resolve stacks capped out. Okay, so next for the mercenaries. Now for the hired mercenaries, I chose Subo to gain vision to all enemies on the map, which will allow us to easily speed farm dungeons. And this is what I chose for the skill path. So first Seeker, which will reveal all enemies and materials in the area. Then I chose the skill Wire Trap, which Subo will place a trap on the ground, stunning and damaging enemies. And then I chose Ready to Hand to greatly increase my movement speed. And the next skill I chose is Cover Fire, which Subo attacks with a volley of arrows, slowing and damaging enemies. And then I chose Opening Fire to greatly increase my critical strike damage when Subo's Cover Fire hits an enemy. And for the reinforcement, I chose Variana. And the skill I chose is Shockwave to knock down enemies for crowd control. And Variana will cast a skill when I cast any skills in combat. Okay, so next for the skill tree. Now this is an endgame build, so you'll need certain gear to easily speed farm tier 100 pits. You will need mythic gear to greatly increase your damage and survivability. But I'll share a build where you don't need to use any mythic uniques in the D4 build planner. But it may be more difficult to speed farm tier 100 pits due to losing some damage and survivability. So starting with the basic skills, I put 4 points into Thunder Spike, a point into Enhanced Thunder Spike, and a point into Accelerated Thunder Spike. And we are not actually using this skill. This skill will autocast when we evade, and on the third evade this skill attacks further and will reset the cooldown of our evades, allowing us to evade infinitely. But I do want to mention that sometimes this skill bugs and the third attack does not come out, so if you run out of evade charges, just use this skill to gain all your evade charges back. Next for the core skills. Now this build will not use any core skills. Next for the focus skills, I put 1 point into Ravager, a point into Enhanced Ravager, and a point into Measured Ravager. And this skill has a passive ability that grants you ferocity, and while this skill is active, your attacks will do more damage, and when you kill an enemy while this skill is active, the duration of this skill is increased. Now we are mainly using this skill to increase our damage. Next I put 1 point into Focal Point and 3 points into Apex, and this skill will greatly increase your vulnerable damage. Next I put 3 points into Mirage, and this skill will increase your dodge chance when you evade, and when you dodge you'll increase your critical strike chance. And next I put 3 points into Unrestrained Power, and this skill will greatly increase your damage while you're unstoppable, and with this build you will always be unstoppable. Next for the defensive skills, I put 5 points into Armored Hide, a point into Enhanced Armor Hide, and a point into Reinforced Armor Hide. And this skill has a passive ability that gains you Resolve stacks, and Resolve will increase your damage reduction, and when you activate this skill you will gain Unstoppable and Max Resolve stacks. And while this skill is active, your block damage reduction is increased for every nearby enemy. Next I put 1 point into Concussive Stomp and a point into Enhanced Concussive Stomp. Now this skill will auto cast because of our runes we are using, and this skill will not be on our skill bar. This skill will do damage and knock down enemies and also grant you a barrier. This skill is important for crowd control and to easily cap out our barrier, which will greatly increase our damage from the Vicious Shield legendary node. Next I put 1 point into Counterattack, a point into Enhanced Counterattack, and a point into Reinforced Counterattack. And we're just getting this skill for the passive buffs. The passive will gain you dodge chance, but most importantly it will greatly increase your critical strike damage for every close enemy. Next I put 1 point into Scourge and a point into Enhanced Scourge, and this skill will call forth the Centipede, poisoning enemies and slowing and fearing enemies around. This skill will also greatly increase your damage to crowd controlled enemies for every enemy this skill crowd controls. Now this skill is really good for greatly increasing your damage, and because of a legendary aspect, the menacing aspect, Scourge will constantly affect enemies around you. Next I put 1 point into Endurance and 3 points into Perseverance, and this skill will gain you damage reduction for each Resolve stack. And since we're stacking tons of Resolve stacks with this build, this skill is really good for survivability. And then I put 1 point into Patient Guard, and we are mainly using this skill to gain a 10% block chance, because increasing your block chance will greatly increase your critical strike damage due to a legendary aspect, the aspect of Redirected Force. And next I put 3 points into Auspicious, and this skill will gain you a barrier for every second. Next for the potency skills, I put 3 points into Resilient to greatly increase my maximum life when casting a Gorilla skill. Next I put 3 points into Brilliance, and this skill will greatly increase your Eagle skill damage based on your movement speed bonus. And next I put 3 points into Acceleration, and this skill is really important for this build to gain additional evade charges. You need to have at least 4 evade charges to infinitely evade with this build. And next I put 3 points into Potent, and this skill will greatly increase your Jaguar skills damage. Next for the ultimate skills, I put 5 points into the Hunter, a point into Harmonious Hunter, and a point into Exalted Hunter. And this skill will leap you to an area doing AoE damage to enemies. This skill will also greatly increase your ferocity, and while this skill is active, you have a chance to reset this skill's cooldown when you kill an enemy. And this skill will even allow you to leap through walls, making it very easy to speed farm dungeons. Next I put 3 points into Resolution, and this skill will greatly increase your damage to elites after casting an ultimate skill. And next I put 1 point into Spiritual Attunement and 3 points into supremacy, and this skill will greatly increase your damage when using your ultimate skill. And next I put 1 point into sustenance and 2 points into intricacy, and this skill will allow you to cast a skill after using your ultimate skill 2 additional times. And this skill is important for a legendary node, the sapping legendary node, to greatly increase our damage. And last but not least, for the key passive, I put a point into adaptive stances, and this states the base spirit of a skill cast grants Eagle plus 30% movement speed, Gorilla 30% damage reduction, Jaguar plus 30% attack speed, Centipede 3% life per second. Casting a skill of a different base spirit swaps to a new bonus. Increase core stats by plus 50% for 7 seconds. Now we are mainly just taking this key passive to greatly increase our core stats to increase our damage. Okay, so that's a full skill tree layout for this Eagle Evade build to easily speed farm tier 100 pits. And I'll have the full skill tree layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, so next for the gear. Now the gear is really important for this build if you want to easily speed farm tier 100 pits. You will need some mythic gears, but I'll share a build in the D4 build planner if you don't have any mythic gear. And some pieces of gear you'll need to triple masterwork specific stats on your gear to greatly increase your damage. And the build in the D4 build planner will have the ideal stats you want on your gear and what you want to masterwork than what I have currently equipped. So starting with the helmet, I'm using the mythic helmet, the Shaco. And this helmet is really strong because it has maximum life, maximum resource, armor, and cooldown reduction. And you're trying to triple masterwork cooldown reduction to get at least 80% cooldown reduction or evade cooldown reduction combined. And the unique aspect states gain 20% damage reduction. In addition, gain plus 4 ranks to all skills. Next for the chest piece, I'm using a mythic chest piece, the Shroud of False Death. And this chest piece is really strong because it gives plus 1 to all passive skills. And for the stats, it has all stats, maximum life, increased damage on next attack after entering stealth, and resource regeneration. And you want to triple masterwork maximum life. And for the unique aspect, it states if you haven't dealt damage in the last 2 seconds, gain stealth and 40% movement speed. Next for the gloves, I'm using the unique gloves, the Fist of Fate. And for the stats, it has attack speed, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, and lucky hit chance to apply a random crowd control effect for 2 seconds. And you want to triple masterwork critical strike chance. And the unique aspect states your attacks randomly deal 1 to 265% of their normal damage. Next for the pants, I have dexterity, maximum life, and armor. And for the tempering stats, I have barrier generation and maximum resolve stacks. And you want to triple masterwork maximum resolve stacks. And the legendary aspect states once an enemy is slowed by at least 80%, they'll also become feared for 3 seconds. You deal 40% increased damage to feared enemies. And with this build, you can easily fear enemies because of the skill Scourge. Next for the boots, I have dexterity, maximum life, and armor. And for the tempering stats, I have evade cooldown reduction and Scourge size. And you want to triple masterwork maximum life. And for the legendary aspect, it states Scourge continuously affect enemies around you for 8 seconds. So this legendary aspect is really strong to always have your Scourge skill constantly affect enemies when you evade. Next for the weapon, I'm using a quarterstaff, and it's important to use a quarterstaff to increase your block chance because increasing your block chance will greatly increase your critical strike damage because of a legendary aspect, the aspect of redirected force. And for the stats, I have dexterity, maximum life, and critical strike damage. And for the tempering stats, I have primary Eagle Spirit Hall potency and Storm Feather potency. And you want to triple masterwork primary Eagle Spirit Hall potency. And the legendary aspect states gain increased critical strike damage equal to 140% of your block chance. Blocking doubles this bonus for 10 seconds. And with this build, you're stacking tons of block chance. So this legendary aspect will greatly increase your damage. Next for the amulet, I have percent dexterity, maximum life, and total armor. And for the tempering stats, I have evade cooldown reduction and maximum resolve stacks. And you want to triple masterwork maximum resolve stacks. And for the legendary aspect, it states gain 23% block chance per resolve stacks. And with this build, we're stacking tons of resolve stacks. So this legendary aspect will greatly increase your block chance, which in return will greatly increase your critical strike damage because of a legendary aspect, the aspect of redirected force. Okay, so next for the rings, I have dexterity, maximum life, and critical strike chance. And for the tempering stats, I have Storm Feather potency and defensive cooldown reduction. And you want to triple masterwork Storm Feather potency. And the legendary aspect states casting a gorilla skill increases your weapon damage by 26% of your armor for 3 seconds, maximum 1500 bonus weapon damage. And with this build, you're stacking tons of armor, so this legendary aspect will greatly increase your damage. And for the second ring, I have dexterity, maximum life, and critical strike chance. And for the tempering stats, I have Storm Feather potency and the hunter cooldown reduction. And you want to triple masterwork Storm Feather potency. And the legendary aspect states when you cast an incinerate skill, enemies around you become vulnerable for 5 seconds. Killing a vulnerable enemy echoes 55% of the killing blow's damage to another nearby enemy. And this legendary aspect is really important to easily destroy groups of enemies. enemies. And really quickly for the runes and gems. So for the helmet, I'm using the Chem rune and the Jaw rune. And this rune set will cast when you evade multiple times. And it will replace your next evade with a sorcerer's teleport, blinking further, dealing damage, and becoming unstoppable. And this rune set is really important to easily speed farm dungeons. And for the armor pieces, I'm using Amnest gems to increase my barrier regeneration. And increasing your barrier regeneration will easily cap out your barrier, which will then greatly increase your damage because of a legendary node, the Vicious Shield legendary node. And for the weapon, I'm using the Zol rune and the Tizik rune. And this rune set will activate when you evoke a skill from another class. And this rune set will allow your Spiritborn to cast Concussive Stomp, dealing damage and knocking down enemies. And because we also took the enhanced Concussive Stomp skill on the skill tree, Concussive Stomp will also grant you a barrier to easily cap out your barrier. So this rune set is important to have Concussive Stomp auto cast for you, and you don't need to manually cast this skill. And on the jewelry, I'm using Skull gems to increase my armor. And increasing your armor is important for this build to greatly increase your damage because of the legendary aspect, the aspect of annihilating hits. So if you checked out my armor, I have 5,242 armor, which is way above the armor cap of 1,000. But the reason I'm stacking this much armor is to greatly increase my damage because of a legendary aspect, the aspect of unyielding hits. And if you checked out my cooldown reduction, I have 49% cooldown reduction because of the mythic helmet, the Shaco. And if you checked out my boots, I have about 20% evade cooldown reduction. And if you checked out my amulet, I have another 20% evade cooldown reduction. So adding up the cooldown reduction and evade cooldown reduction, I have about 90%, which is important because you need at least 80% cooldown reduction and evade cooldown reduction combined to have infinite evades. Okay, so I did showcase a build layout to easily speed farm tier 100 pits. And you'll need to triple masterwork specific stats on your gear as it's crucial for significantly boosting your damage. And the full build layout will be in the D4 build planner link in the description below. But I'll also share a non-mythic gear build if you are having trouble getting the mythic gear in the D4 build planner as well. Okay, so next for the Paragon board. Now this is a fully optimized Paragon board for this build. Now ideally you will need to be at least at Paragon level 240 to get the important nodes to easily speed farm tier 100 pits. Now I'm just going to quickly go over this Paragon board, going over the important nodes and glyphs, but I'll have the full Paragon board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. And I do want to mention that in the D4 build planner, I will leave out 50 Paragon points because those Paragon points you can spend however you like. But ideally you would want to put points into your glyphs to increase your damage. So starting with the starter board, I'm using the Spirit glyph. And additional bonus states critical strikes increase your damage an enemy takes from you by 3% for 20 seconds up to 15%. So this glyph will greatly increase your critical strike damage. The next Paragon board I took is Vicious Shield. And the glyph I'm using is Jagged Plume. And additional bonus states spawning a Storm Feather grants 3% increased damage and 5% increased movement speed for 5 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. So this glyph will greatly increase your Storm Feather's damage. I also took the legendary node Vicious Shield, which states you do 1% increased damage for each 3% of maximum life you have as a barrier. And this build does have a lot of maximum life and you can easily cap out your barrier. So this legendary node will greatly increase your damage. Then heading right this way. And the next Paragon board I took is Sapping. And the glyph I'm using is Talon. And additional bonus states your eagle skills deal 15% increased critical strike damage. And since our main damaging skill is an eagle skill, this glyph will greatly increase our damage. I also took the legendary node Sapping. And this states when you cast 3 gorilla, jaguar, eagle, or centipede skills with the same spirit in a row, restore 15% of your vigor and deal 30% increased damage for 5 seconds. So because of the intricacy skill on the skill tree, we can easily cast 3 skills of the same spirit in a row. So this legendary node will greatly increase your damage. Then heading right this way. And the next Paragon board I took is Convergence. And the glyph I'm using is Fulminate. And additional bonus states you deal 12% increased lightning damage to both healthy and injured enemies. So this glyph will greatly increase your lightning damage. I also took the legendary node Convergence, which states you deal bonus damage equal to 20% of your 2 highest bonus to damage types combined, up to 30% total. So this legendary node will greatly increase your damage. Then heading down this way. And the last Paragon board I took is Revealing. And the glyph I'm using is Colossal. And the additional bonus states you deal 2% increased damage for each stack of resolve you have. And with this build you're stacking tons of resolve, so this glyph will greatly increase your damage. I also took the legendary node Revealing, which states lucky hit up to a 30% chance to knock down vulnerable enemies. You deal 30% increased damage to crowd controlled enemies. So since this build has tons of crowd control, this legendary node will greatly increase your damage. And make sure you take all the rare nodes and magic nodes that increases your maximum life and armor to greatly increase your damage and survivability. Okay, so that's a fully optimized Paragon board for this build for maximizing your damage and survivability. And you want to get your glyphs at level 100 to maximize your damage. And like I mentioned before, I'll have this full Paragon board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best, strongest, and fastest Eagle Evade Spiritborn build in Season 6. With this build, you can easily speed farm tier 100 pits in under 2 minutes. With this build, you should have maximum damage and survivability to clear the hardest content in the game. This is a really fun and easy build to play, and I'll have this full build layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Hope this helps in more Diablo 4 videos to come, so stay tuned. And of course,